Hello and welcome. I am live from Pellam's Wasteland, and today I've got another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads for you guys. This time covering Flame and Crimson, A History of Sword and Sorcery by Brian Murphy. And I expect that this episode will be pretty short because I think this is a book that you should check out if you are interested in the subject matter. Um, and I don't necessarily have a whole lot more to say about it than that. I think this is a fairly well done literary history, essentially a history of the specific genre of sword and sorcery, starting with its origins in the pulps, and even before that, with a number of kind of pre-sword and sorcery authors. Some discussion of like Harold Lamb and Edgar Burroughs, and a whole discussion of Lord Dunsany, and even some of the very kind of narrowly pre-Howardian sort of sword and sorcery ish things that were published in Weird Tales, or some of the other kind of pulpy adventure stuff. And then out through basically the end of the 1980s, the 1990s, there's a chapter at the end that gets into kind of the history of sword and sorcery after its kind of basically dilution into its most kind of absurd and least valuable elements, for lack of a better term. The idea of basically what happened to sword and sorcery as the kind of narrative of this story is that, well, it turns into it basically goes from something that is like a serious adventure stories that have all these tropes to kind of just the tropes, and more bad stuff comes out, and eventually the good stuff that's coming out is kind of overwhelmed by the bad stuff, and you have less and less of anything actually worth reading or watching or whatever else within sword and sorcery as a genre. And so the genre pretty much largely stops, with kind of small pockets keeping it alive. But then the last chapter of the book talks sort of about some of those pockets and some of the kind of different ways that sword and sorcery has survived on. So there's a discussion of role playing games and the Appendix N, with Gary Gygax, but also with just kind of modern role playing games and video games, and the way that structurally a lot of games work really well for the kind of um, energized action heroes who have very kind of driven goals and all that sort of stuff. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And some discussion of like um, movies and music in particular. Obviously, there's a lot of heavy metal music that has taken inspiration from fantasy literature in general, and especially sword and sorcery as a subset of fantasy. So that's kind of where the book ends, with this the proliferation of sword and sorcery into all of these other places in um, music and video games and tabletop RPGs, and books from kind of revivalist small presses, and art, all of the very famous Frank Frazetta and Boris Vallejo paintings that have survived from being kind of originally covers for all these reprint things often. So anyway, um, it's a good overview of all of this material, and I think for me, as someone who knew about a fair bit of the material, right, most of the authors are authors that if I haven't necessarily read anything from them, or haven't read a book that is specifically from them, I have often read a little bit of some of their stuff, one short story in a collection, maybe two, things like that. Or they're authors that, the name is definitely familiar just because of their role in sword and sorcery as a genre, even if I haven't read that much of theirs. So, El Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter are a great example where I haven't read very much of either of them. I've read a little bit of both of them just from appearing in collections, but they also have a famous role as being really central to the revival of Robert E. Howard. And the book talks a fair bit about that, about kind of the complicated relationship between um, those two men and Robert E. Howard, and the kind of questions of the value of the revival of Howard's work on the one hand, and then on the other, the changes that they made, or the strange editing choices, or the ways that they watered down things of Howard's, or just generally the sort of core argument being that they weren't as good writers, at least not in the very specific Howardian style. So it's a complicated relationship. Obviously, it's unlikely that the Howard revival would have happened in precisely the same way without the two of them and a couple of other people, obviously. But at the same time, I think uh, there's reason to be skeptical of kind of the way that it happened, and in particular, there's a discussion of El Sprague de Camp as being very kind of persnickety with the details, you might say, criticizing Robert E. Howard for minor kind of historical or semi-historical inaccuracies. There's a discussion, I think it's from Kings of the Night, the Bran McMorn story that also has not Conan, Cull in it, um, and that he makes reference to stirrups. And obviously, there weren't cavalry using stirrups in this period of the kind of later Roman Empire. And Elsbrag de Camp is poking, not necessarily maliciously, but kind of poking a bit of fun at this historical inaccuracy, and the obvious response being, does it like actually matter that much for this particular story whether or not in history these people would have had access to stirrups, because their cavalry would have performed roughly the same sort of role, um, and that basically that it doesn't matter at all, and it's silly to act like it's a kind of a special, or act like it's a meaningful failure on Robert E. Howard's part to have made that particular historical inaccuracy. And that's sort of used generally as a way to talk about like um, what sort of things Elsperg de Camp was often basically making the case that Elsperg de Camp in his own kind of writing of Howard Pastiche and his editing of Howard was overly concerned with these sorts of things that don't really matter, basically. Um, and too concerned with all these details and not concerned enough with the kind of overarching theme and tone of the story in the way that Howard was clearly more concerned with that. So, anyway, as a resource for understanding sword and sorcery, and especially just as a reading list, basically, I think this is really great. There's so many, even minor authors who get mentioned. I remember there's a mention of The Flame Winds, which is a book that I read a number of years ago that's very, very minor, kind of sort of semi sword and sorcery. It's a story about Prester John, and so it's kind of historical adventure fiction. But there's a lot of things like that, of minor things, minor authors, and plenty of major authors as well, who get some amount of discussion. Some talk about kind of where they fit within the broader genealogy of sword and sorcery as a genre, some discussion of like why you should read their particular books and their particular flavor, and really just a great resource for anyone who is interested in sword and sorcery, centered on Robert E. Howard and beyond, on all these other figures who wrote good books too. So that's really cool. I think that's a neat thing. A lot of the different authors, are not impossible to find without this resource, but I think this is a really good resource for having that kind of specific list of a whole bunch of authors, basically a bunch of things, and doing a better job of, I think, by comparison with, even to use the comparison of like Appendix N. Um, Appendix N is interesting because Gary Gygax clearly really liked pulpy trash, and so a lot of the stuff on Appendix N is just the things that Gary liked. It seems like, at least for the very first version of that list. Um, and that it is not specifically attempting to be a like genre defining list of sword and sorcery, pulp fantasy, anything like that. So this really is attempting to be something like that, a broad overview of pretty much all of the authors that fall into this particular genre at one time or another. There's some discussion of, there are some authors who wrote kind of pulp fantasy, sword and sorcery for a while, and then ended up writing other stuff. Plenty of authors who wrote basically kind of sword and sorcery stuff in like the 30s and into the 40s, and then switched over to more of like golden age sci-fi in the 50s, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon. But really, this is, I think, a really good for anyone who is interested in sword and sorcery as a literary genre, as a broad, yeah, as a genre that has historical roots, that has some amount of historical development. There's some discussion of the way that a lot of the kind of later instances of sword and sorcery are, in some ways, a deliberate response to the earlier versions. So, like the idea of Elric as sort of an anti Conan, right? Or even, I think, Karl Edward Wagner's Kane, who's a favorite of mine. I really enjoy Karl Edward Wagner's books, as also being a sort of commentary on the nature of this sword and sorcery literature, as much as it is its own thing that exists by itself. And so that's really interesting in here to see that kind of whole history laid out for, not really a full century, when you consider that Brian Murphy doesn't really start sword and sorcery until you have Robert E. Howard's writing of the Shadow Kingdoms. Although he talks about some of the earlier stuff that could fit, like I said, and then basically ends in the late 80s as kind of the end of the heyday of sword and sorcery. So you've got a good chunk of time with, like I said, that kind of historical development, all sorts of interesting characters, and fun discussion of um, things like the way that a lot of the kind of fanzines work, or fanzines, I guess you would say, like magazine, um, which is a cool thing too. It's a bit that I think would be easy to leave out of an official history, but a discussion of these kind of fairly small, relative to like a books publication, but places where there was still a lot of like discussion of Robert E. Howard and printing of Howardian style short stories and things like that. And so that's really neat to see some of this um, kind of secondary material that was going on throughout the period of this book also. So yeah, anyway, it's good. It's a really, I think for me the big thing would be it as a resource of having collected all of this material about sword and sorcery, that I think this is a good way to make sure you don't miss too many authors if you're interested in reading a lot of sword and sorcery, and especially kind of understanding the long-term development of the genre, like I said. um, so yeah, I This is not really, I guess I will say, this is not really like this is not really literary analysis. It is much more literary history, much more concerned with a lot of the kind of events of publishing and some amount of understanding, like I said, kind of a historical genealogy more than it is, right, like a specific, here's a text and we're going to explicate this specific text. So, um, not necessarily that you would expect that, but it is a sort of a different genre of secondary writing. So, anyway, Flame and Crimson, it's quite good. Go check it out. I have a digital copy. There were a couple of minor formatting errors on my digital copy. So who knows what was up with that. Hopefully on a print copy, those wouldn't be around. But it was pretty cheap. It was, like $5 or $6 on the Kindle store, I think. So totally worth checking out for like 250, 300 pages of great sword and sorcery history. So yeah, if you are interested in this type of genre, and I suspect that if you were, listening to what I have to say about books, you probably have some interest in this sort of thing, because I have some interest in this sort of thing, and a lot of the stuff that I've talked about has, well, I don't know about a lot of it having necessarily a connection with it, but certainly the earlier stuff that I talked about with regard to books, a lot more has a connection to this. Check it out. Anyway, that is going to be it for me for today. Thank you so much for listening to what I have to say about Flame and Crimson, A History of Sword and Sorcery. I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.